I would love to introduce Professor Richard Carson, who is the former chair and a professor at the Department of Economics at the University of California, San Diego. He's the immediate past president of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists and a senior fellow at the San Diego Supercomputer Center. We'll be talking about some new insights and some research that Richard performed very recently and actually kind of broke to the public just this month.
Yes.
And I thought we might start with the important fact that China has surpassed the US as the world's largest emitter of CO2 just this past year. And this was a very big surprise. I think that, that most scientists thought that that would happen, but would happen quite a ways out into the future. Richard, really his work is the first to show this phenomenon, and he's been featured in major news media around the world with this insight. I was wondering if we could start and really talk about what you have found and a little bit about how the information that you gained was distinctive.
Okay. Let me pull up one slide. I've actually only got 2 slides. So here's basically what's been happening in China. Black line is the actual emissions. The red line is the forecast that I recently had published, which was the first paper to show that the Chinese in 2006 had earned the dubious distinction of passing the United States as the world's leading emitter of carbon dioxide. There are unofficial estimates which show that the black line is unfortunately following almost exactly the red line that we forecast. And the gray area there represents the range of forecasts that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been working with for China. This is a tremendous sort of increase in Chinese greenhouse gas emissions. People had thought that China was going to surpass the United States, but by 2020 or 2030, what we're seeing here are numbers which suggest that at least at the low end by 2010, China will be roughly, I should say, at least by 2015, Chinese greenhouse gas emissions will be on the order of twice US emissions. This is a staggering increase in world emissions. And to follow the logic here in terms of what James McCarthy was showing you is that the business as usual path is much above what people thought that it was going to be.
What are some of the underlying, I mean, if you look at what's happened and what are some of the underlying trends that are propelling this? I think all of us, we've heard about coal plants, and we're I think, familiar with the rapid economic development. But what are some of the sort of underlying issues that are going on and some of the sort of contradictions in our thinking around technological progress?
So there are 3 big factors that lie behind China's dramatic increase in CO2 emissions. The first factor is that China's economy has simply been growing consistently over the last decade at roughly 10%. So everyone who was forecasting this essentially assumed that China's economic growth rate would fall back toward sort of more normal, very high levels, say roughly on the order of 3 to 5%. And so a lot of what you're seeing here is just simply a reflection of continued rapid growth that shows almost no signs of abating. The second big factor, which was largely ignored in the initial forecast, and that was because China had pretty good control over where its population was living up until roughly about 2000, but the population is moving from the rural areas to the urban areas, and when that occurs, greenhouse gas emissions per capita go up about 25%. So unfortunately, this promises to be a huge factor in both China and India and a number of other developing countries. And the third factor is probably the most remarkable given all the talk of technological progress and hope for the future that was seen here. China's the first big country that on a per dollar basis of output has actually turned the situation around. Instead of the carbon content per dollar going down, the carbon content per dollar starting around 2000 started to go up quite substantially.
Part of what I thought was interesting in the paper is you discussed really the methodology for really understanding this by going in at the provincial level. Describe a little bit of what's happened and what might be different in terms of...
So most people, in fact almost all the people doing the forecasting for China had previously thought of China as one country, but when you look at China, there's a couple things that are going on. First off, each Chinese province is typically larger than a large European country. And the technology and what's going on across the Chinese provinces is very, very different. The southern coastal provinces are becoming quite wealthy, quite technologically advanced. So is the Beijing and Shanghai region. And so when you hear all the sort of good things coming out of China, it's typically the technological innovation that you see in those areas. What's happened over the last decade is that the growth in China has moved inland to the sort of core central provinces, where unfortunately which unfortunately are closely located next to large and very dirty coal reserves. And so that's where you're seeing a lot of the growth coming out of now.
So I think the press has covered quite a bit of the preparation for the Olympics and some of the progress that's being made. And but what's your sense if you look out longer term and think about the series of steps to reverse this trend? What are the steps that can be taken, and what do you think is happening and will be happening to address CO2?
I should say short term. I was in Beijing for 5 weeks this past summer. I actually do think they'll succeed on the Olympics. The government owns a large fraction of the cars in Beijing. They're going to take those off the road. Right. They're going to shut down lots of industry for hundreds of miles and import the electricity. So I suspect that the air quality in Beijing will actually dramatically improve for the Olympics. Longer term, I'm much less sanguine. The Chinese government, in spite of announcing very ambitious goals, when you look at those goals are no longer in terms of, in some sense, reducing the absolute levels of CO2, but are actually just cutting back on this negative technology change in carbonization. So when you look deeply, the goals are maybe achievable, but won't cut much off of this. The other big problem the Chinese government has is that they're still into thinking of a command and control economy based in Beijing, whereas this dramatic growth in CO2 emissions from China is largely the result of devolving power in Beijing to the provincial level energy officials. And so they have a mandate simply to put on megawatts of electricity. Turns out the mayors in the Chinese cities are the big proponents of cleaning up the air pollution. And why is that? The World Bank's estimate are that almost 1 million people in China are dying every year from the air pollution.
I think, clearly the theme that emerged before lunch was that the clock has run out. And I would like to hear your thoughts on what is the sense of urgency and in terms of time frame for action?
So what's interesting about the release of this paper and a couple others that have come to the same conclusion since this paper first started circulating is that both those who are pro doing something about climate change and those that are anti doing something about climate change have adopted this paper. The anti group says, well, basically the gig is up. It really does not matter what the US does. Looking at these numbers, just to put them in perspective, the annual growth in Chinese CO2 emissions last year was larger than the total emission levels of Germany, which is the world's third largest economy. I mean, it should just sink in for a moment. We're talking about an increase in Chinese emissions levels, which are somewhere between 5 and 10 times the total savings envisioned under the Kyoto Protocol. So that's the negative side. The positive side is, and this is to follow James McCarthy, if anything, the implications of what will happen with the level of CO2 that are likely to result from this are so frightening and shocking that to sit here and say, we're not looking at the low or the middle range of what he was talking about. We're actually looking at the upper end and perhaps even substantially higher. And that behooves us to do something. So it's clear that China won't do anything until the US does something. And so the question here is, what can we do and what can the industrialized countries, the OECD countries, do to, in some sense, bring China around, if not force China to do something?
So what's your thoughts on how a carbon tax, how that might work in China and the relationship with the U.S. and that?
Let's see. Last fall, Max Offheimer, one of my graduate students who's now at UC Berkeley, and I had an op-ed piece in the Washington Post where we advanced an idea which is starting to get some traction, that China would actually benefit from placing a very large carbon tax on its own emissions. And the reason for that is if you put on a large carbon tax, it would, of course, reduce the carbon emissions, but you could also reduce in China a number of other taxes which are hurting the formation of business and hurting consumers and in general slowing down the economy. And so this almost looks like a win-win solution for China is to put on what an economist would call as a revenue-neutral carbon tax, put on a big carbon tax and watch the economy shift. So, why hasn't this in some sense been done? Our back-of-the-envelope calculations suggest that in 10 years, China's economy would actually grow faster. And why is that? China has a very inefficient tax system. It has massive externalities, bad air pollution effects on health that dwarf almost anything that anybody's ever seen. The big reason is that in the short run, over 3 to 4 years, the growth rate in China's economy would take a pretty big hit as the economy moves away from its current growth path, which is almost entirely driven by a really ugly combination of coal and concrete. So the Chinese political leaders are very afraid of exactly what US political leaders have always shied from, is the disruption that will come from trying to turn the economy, even though in the long run, you can show that they'll actually grow quicker. Now, what's ironic about China is you can show that a carbon tax would be good for China's long-run economic growth rate. It's much more difficult to show that for the United States. And that's largely driven by the fact that China's inefficiency in the energy sectors and the adverse environmental impacts are just so much larger in China. The World Bank's rough estimate is that close to half of China's phenomenal growth rate would be is due to driving down the environmental conditions in the country.
How will China's rising CO2 emissions play into trade policy, as you see, with the United States and the EU? And
well, the surprising thing, I think, to a lot of people is that U.S. CO2 emissions over roughly since 2000 have largely been unchanged, and on a per capita basis, actually even going downward. And the reason for that is that to a larger and larger degree, we're importing the carbon from China. And what you've seen in Europe, and pushed very hard by the French, and the Europeans look very close to doing it, and I'm sure would do it if the US were to join along, and that is to put a tariff on imported products from countries that don't have either a carbon tax or the equivalent cap and trade program. McCain has announced this. The New York Times noted that he had left out the carbon tariff part of his plan, so as appear not to be against free trade. But the one thing that will behoove China, as soon as the Europeans, and particularly followed by the US and the Japanese, were to put on this tariff, which if you look at the Democratic candidates, the labor and environmental forces will say, you know, why should we sort of push more and more of this offshore? You know, and it doesn't matter where in the world you put up the carbon dioxide. So I think the handwriting is on the wall. The US will move to some type of cap and trade system under any of the political leaders. As soon as the US has that system in place, the Europeans are basically prepared to move with putting on the tariff. The Japanese seem amenable to putting on the tariff for the same reason. Once you have a tariff based on the carbon content of the goods, if the country hasn't implemented the same tax or equivalent carbon cap and trade system, it really behooves the exporting country, in this case China, to go ahead and put on the tax and keep the money themselves rather than giving it up as a tariff.
so oddly enough, it becomes a virtuous circle.
Yes, it becomes a virtuous circle, and economists have sort of long recognized that at some level you can't, as long as you just run up the price of carbon in Europe or Japan or the US, then it doesn't matter whether you do it with taxes or cap and trade or regulation, you simply offshore lots of the imports of the carbon, and so there's a way to close the circle.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess turning back to look at Japan's current path, what do you think are the implications that we should be paying attention to, and maybe what are some of the business implications for those of us who are doing business here and in China?
I think the implications in China are very similar to here. If indeed the energy prices stay high, and government can do a fair amount to ensure that that's the case, the Chinese economy is such that it will be hard for the government to implement these changes just by simply ordering people to do it, although clearly it has more control over heavy industry in China than we do in the US. But as long as the carbon prices stay high, the Chinese will have the incentive to adopt better technology, and, you know, coupled with technological innovation occurring in the United States, Europe, Japan, and around the world, and to a large extent in China, you'll see this implemented. So what our work shows is that in the southern coastal provinces, the technology going in is actually fairly good technology, and that's largely driven by the price of coal, because the shipping is fairly high to ship it from the central part of the country to near Hong Kong. And they're actually buying coal on the world market from Australia, so they're paying world prices. And so as you see the carbon prices the effective price of coal drop in China, you see dirtier facilities. And so I think the same message is here. As soon as you raise the price of carbon high enough, you won't see the dirty facilities go in. And in fact, in the very worst case, you're replicating 1955 Soviet technology. That's what's driven this remarkable, in some sense, downturn in the technological efficiency level in China, which is so startling. So, and why is that happening? The Chinese are subsidizing the prices of coal. And why are they subsidizing the prices of coal? They're subsidizing the prices of coal to drive the export sector.
Are there examples that you can think of and provinces or sectors where they're leapfrogging, where the technology, solar, other alternatives are moving forward, perhaps even faster than?
There's certainly cases, and this is, I think, the great promise and the great threat of China. So in the US, you usually talk about, replacing an old, dirty coal-fired power plant in the US with windmills or solar thermal or geothermal or something. And so at some level, you're taking the bad stuff off. But China's building a huge new electric power plant roughly on the order of every week. So you're putting in technology that will last 40 to 70 years. So one of the reasons that we're doing, in some sense, such a good job forecasting is that we have a model that has a capital vintage in it. So in some sense, once you put this stuff in, you've locked down your technology path for quite a while. And so it presents an opportunity because every sort of good thing that you put in will stay around a long time. But we're at a critical juncture now, given how fast China's growing, that if you go another decade building the stuff that you see that they've been building recently, the gig really is up.
Where do you see China's CO2 emissions heading in the future?
Clearly, they're going up. They're going way up, and
Scott?
we should go to the next slide here. And let's just first sort of look at the blue bars. This is a pretty, in contrast to the previous estimate, which is a very sophisticated econometric estimate. This is just a straight extrapolation about what's going on now. The blue bars with data currently available. China's CO2 emissions will be roughly half of the total world emissions. What you can see is if we go down this, starting on the left, the blue bars are the straight extrapolation that you would have made in 1983 when the US first considered regulating carbon dioxide. The next bar is when the world agreed in 1992 at Rio that it was going to do something about carbon dioxide and made, in my view, the really disastrous decision that that the industrialized countries were going to go first, and that we, in some sense, had time for the developing countries to quote unquote catch up, which China's done with frightening efficiency. 90s, and at that point, you can see that the U.S. looks like it's the big part of the world problem. The yellow bar is when the Kyoto Protocol was signed, and now you can actually see U.S. emissions are pretty much forecasted to drop quite a bit, and that's because the people who, when we do this, we actually count on the people in this room to come up with lots of good technology.
We have to deliver.
I did forecasts for the U.S. economy in the early 80s, forecasting a change from 1980 to 2000, it was only off by 6%. Most of that was due to the population increasing a little bit faster than expected. So the notion that you can forecast, not being able to forecast the oil price series is sort of a parlor trick that you use to make economists look bad. But forecasting this sort of thing is, in some sense, straightforward because you're just locking in the technology. You're getting prices driving the technology. And you can see that the economies, early on, the economies of Africa, Latin America, and whatever stalled relative to Asia. And so you see a picture for the year 2050, in which case China is the dominant force. The rest of Asia, driven to a large extent by India, is coming up pretty quick, but India hasn't taken off like China. So this is a pretty ugly view of the world. This is not, as James McCarthy was talking about, this isn't keeping emissions at 450 the CO2 concentrations at 450 parts per million. It's not even a doubling of CO2, which is roughly 550. We're talking, the map sort of shown here, the path we're on, is somewhere between a tripling and close to a quadrupling. This is a frightening picture for your children and grandchildren.
So, we've obviously, I think one of the points that you've made is if we can get if we can actually do something to put a price on carbon and thereby, in terms of our trading partners, move this, what are the keys to success? What increases the odds that we'll actually pass some legislation to get this done?
I'm very hopeful that we'll see legislation, no matter whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans nominated. I think as soon as the U.S. passes legislation, part of that legislation will be to put things on an equal footing by going to some variant of this carbon tariff, even if it's phased in. The French are pushing it and basically have agreement within the EU that they'll do it. So I think as soon as the major industrialized countries do this, they'll see the handwriting on the wall. The Chinese know that they have a serious problem. If I put the blue bar up there, for China, do I think that is actually what's going to happen in the future? That's the path that we're currently on. I really don't think it could happen in the future because I don't think you can kill that many people in the cities with the level of air pollution. The Chinese mayors of the big cities in China are the biggest advocates for doing something about this. So I think the consequences ignoring global climate change of that happening are pretty ugly. And so no country who's faced that path in the past has not retreated and in some sense cleaned up the local air, which means cleaning up the coal.
Thanks. I think it's clear to say that we don't believe that economics is a branch of physics, but it may be true that it is the dismal science.
It's the dismal science.
Yeah. Is there hope? I mean, do you feel hopeful?
I think there's hope. I think that the hope is if we can keep the price of carbon, the price of energy high, there will indeed be an outpouring of innovation which will bring those prices down. So I think there's clearly a price to be paid for the current generation of having to experience clearly some pain of shifting away from fossil fuels and some pain until there's enough innovation to turn the ship largely away from coal. And the problem in China is just the coal reserves are so large and so cheap that the prices are going to have to come down. And I don't know that the Chinese have the political willpower, just like the US public and politicians haven't had the willpower to bite the bullet and say that we have to do this. And the long run future, if we don't do it, is fairly bleak. I think we've got a chance, a rare opportunity where world demand for oil and other things has effectively driven the price up. The usual notion is that we'll get more supply and we'll get it in some fashion, the prices will go down. If we don't keep the prices up, that will kill the technological innovation like it has every other time everybody has been optimistic that something is going to happen.
Do we time out for questions? Are we done? One question.
Davin Usala, Infotech Research Group. I just have a quick question on the increase. Where do cars factor into that? We hear huge talk of the growth in cars in China. And you seem to mention industry a lot. So.
Yeah, cars right now are actually a fairly minor factor. They're roughly 3% of CO2 emissions currently in China. So are cars driving the current problem? The answer is clearly no. Will cars drive the problem in the future? Well, China's at 3% with regard to cars. The U.S. for at least motor vehicle transportation is in the low 30s. But China's got an awfully long way to go. So if you say, why do things look so much bleaker in the future? You take the numbers that we projected out to 2010 or 2015, and you now graph on the number of cars that would be projected for China as its income increases, and you can see that the CO2 emissions will just keep climbing straight up. And there's no reason to think that they'll turn down.
Okay. Question out there?
Eric Blatchford from TerraPass. So it wasn't supposed to work like this. What was supposed to happen was the clean development mechanism was supposed to give the Chinese lots of incentives to build out renewable sources of energy, and that the carbon credit revenue from that was going to more than outweigh any kind of subsidy for coal production. So I guess that's not working.
Yeah, I could sit here and say that it's a sick joke, but but I should say that's not completely true. The clean development mechanism was never, in some sense, intended to deal with a China that was throwing off Germany or the UK's emission levels every year. So the clean development program is a very limited program. Clearly, it's actually in China helping pave the way for China to be able to leapfrog over a lot of the bad stuff which is being currently put in. But if you say, is there any way the clean development mechanism is scalable to the sort of emissions that we see coming out of China? The answer is clearly no. I mean, the clean development mechanism was only supposed to, absorb a tiny fraction of the reductions envisioned under Kyoto, and we see China outstripping the total Kyoto reductions by a factor of 5 to 10.
We've got to stop. But thank you so much, Richard.